Some crimes take a life, but some crimes change the law itself. In the early morning hours of August 31, 2003 in Las Cruces, New Mexico, 22-year-old Katie Sepich walked home after a party. She was only 2 blocks away from safety, minutes from her bed, but she never made it inside. What happened in those quiet moments would not only devastate her family, it would expose a flaw in the justice system and lead to a law that would change DNA collection across America. This is the story of Katie Sepich and the system that failed her before it finally worked. In 2003, Las Cruces was known as a quiet, college town, the kind of place where students walked home late at night without thinking twice, where Labor Day weekend meant house parties, music drifting through open windows, and young people celebrating the end of summer. It was home to New Mexico State University, and at the start of a new semester, the energy in the city always felt hopeful, familiar, safe. Katie Sepich was 22 years old, a recent graduate with a business degree, intelligent, outspoken, and determined. Her family described her as confident and strong-willed, someone who believed in speaking honestly even when it was uncomfortable. She had plans for graduate school, plans for a career, plans for a future that seemed just within reach. She had worked hard for her degree, and this moment in her life was supposed to be the beginning of something bigger. To her parents, Gianne and Dave Sepich, she was more than accomplished. She was the heart of their family, a daughter who filled rooms with energy, who debated passionately, who loved deeply and lived fully. Her friends remembered her laugh, her stubborn streak, and the way she refused to back down from an argument, even when it might have been easier on the night of August 30th, leading into the early morning hours of August 31st, Katie attended a house party near her home. It was filled with classmates and familiar faces. Nothing about the gathering felt dangerous. There were no strangers causing problems, no chaos spilling into the street. It was the kind of party that blended into dozens of others that happened every semester. But inside the house, tension began to rise. Katie and her boyfriend at the time, Joe Bischoff, were arguing. Their relationship had been described by friends as complicated, on-again, off-again, passionate but unstable. That night, unresolved issues surfaced once again. Voices were raised. Frustration lingered in the air. People nearby noticed but did not see anything unusual. Arguments between young couples at crowded parties were not rare, and no one believed it would lead to anything more. Around 3 a.m., Katie decided she had enough. She walked out of the house. Alone, upset, and needing space, her home was only about 2 blocks away, a short and familiar walk through streets she had traveled many times before. She did not ask for company. She did not appear afraid. She simply wanted to leave the argument behind. In her rush to get out, she forgot her keys. She left her phone and purse inside the house. Small details that did not seem important in the moment. She likely assumed she would knock on the door or find another way inside once she got home. The neighborhood was quiet, most of the town asleep, porch lights glowing softly in the darkness. There were no signs of danger, no warnings in the still air. Katie was minutes from her bedroom, minutes from safety. When she reached her house and realized the door was locked, she chose a practical solution. Instead of waking anyone inside or going back to the party, she went to her bedroom window along the side of the house. It was something she had done before. It matched her independent personality. She did not panic, she problem-solved. But that decision placed her in a vulnerable position, partially hidden from the street, focused on getting inside, unaware that she was not alone. In those quiet, early morning minutes, while the rest of Las Cruces slept, someone else was there, watching, waiting, and what happened next would shatter the sense of safety that town had always taken for granted. The next morning in Las Cruces, nothing seemed unusual at first. The sun rose over the desert landscape. Students slowly woke up after a long holiday weekend night, and life appeared to move forward as it always had. But for Katie Sepich's friends, something felt off. Katie was not answering her phone. She had not returned home in the way people expected. At first, the concern was quiet. Maybe she stayed with a friend. Maybe she needed space after the argument. Maybe she was sleeping in. But as the hours passed, that calm uncertainty shifted into real fear. Friends began calling each other, asking the same question over and over. Have you seen Katie? Did she make it home? Did anyone walk with her? No one had answers. The last confirmed sighting was her leaving the party alone around 3 a.m. By late morning, worry spread beyond her immediate circle. People started retracing the night in their minds, remembering the argument, remembering how quickly she walked out, remembering that she left without her purse and keys, details that suddenly felt important. Then, miles away from campus and residential streets, two men near a remote desert area close to the local landfill made a discovery that would change everything. The area was isolated, a stretch of open land where people sometimes went for target practice, far removed from the busy streets near New Mexico State University. At first, what they saw did not immediately register. From a distance, it was just something out of place in the sand and brush, but as they moved closer, the reality became clear. It was a body. Authorities were called immediately, law enforcement secured the scene, investigators began documenting every detail. Word of a major incident started to circulate quietly through police channels before reaching the public, when officials confirmed. The victim was a young woman. Anxiety gripped the community when her identity was officially released as 22-year-old Katie Sepich. That anxiety turned into shock. This was not a stranger passing through town. This was someone local. Someone who had been at a party just hours earlier. Someone whose face people recognized, whose name they knew. News spread quickly across Las Cruces. Students who had felt comfortable walking home late at night suddenly questioned that sense of security. Parents called their children, urging caution. Doors that were once left unlocked were now double-checked. For Katie's parents, Gianne and Dave Sepich, the nightmare became real in the most devastating way possible. They were pulled into a world of police briefings, hospital rooms, and unanswered questions, a world no parent ever expects to enter. Friends gathered in small groups, holding on to one another, replaying every moment from the party, wondering if there had been a sign, something they missed, something that might have changed the outcome. Police held press conferences asking for help, urging anyone who had seen Katie after she left the party to come forward. Tips began pouring in, some specific, some vague, some based on instinct rather than fact. Investigators worked carefully, focusing not only on where Katie was found but also on the last place she was known to be alive. They examined the route she would have taken home, canvassed the neighborhood, and began the meticulous process of collecting forensic evidence. Underneath the grief and shock, one question echoed throughout the community. Who did this, and how? Could something so violent happen in a place that had always felt so safe? As investigators in Las Cruces began piecing together Katie Sepich's final movements, they quickly realized this case would depend heavily on forensic evidence. There were no eyewitnesses to the attack, no surveillance cameras capturing the moment, no clear suspect fleeing the scene. What they did have was something invisible to the naked eye but powerful in the right hands: DNA. From the evidence recovered, forensic teams were able to develop a genetic profile belonging to the person responsible. It was strong evidence, the kind that in many cases leads directly to an arrest. Investigators believed that if they could match the profile to someone in the system, the case could move. Quickly, the profile was entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database used by law enforcement agencies across the United States. CODIS quietly compares DNA profiles from crime scenes to profiles already stored in the system, searching for matches that can connect suspects to crimes. But there was a problem. The database only works if the right DNA is already inside it. In 2003, New Mexico law did not require DNA to be collected at the time of arrest for violent felonies. Instead, DNA was typically taken only after a conviction for certain serious crimes. That meant if someone had been arrested, but not yet convicted, their genetic profile might not exist in CODIS. When Katie's DNA evidence was uploaded, there was no match. Investigators were left with a complete genetic fingerprint of the killer, but no name attached to it. Detectives shifted to traditional investigative work. They interviewed everyone who had been at the party. They re-examined Katie's relationships. They spoke with neighbors, classmates, and acquaintances. They followed up on every tip that came in, some detailed, some vague, some based on nothing more than suspicion. They ruled people out one by one. Each time someone was cleared, the list grew shorter. but it never reached zero. Behind the scenes, the DNA profile remained in CODIS, waiting. Every time a new profile was entered anywhere in the country, the system would automatically compare it to Katie's case, hoping for a hit. But days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. There was still no match. For Katie's family, this period was agonizing. They were told the evidence was strong. They were told science could identify the killer. But they were also told that without a match in the system, investigators had no legal way to force a comparison unless they had probable cause to obtain a warrant. It felt like standing at the edge of the answer but being unable to reach it. The community of Las Cruces tried to return to normal life. Classes resumed at New Mexico State University. Students attended lectures and football games. But the sense of security had been shaken. Somewhere, the person responsible for a brutal murder was still free. Investigators understood something critical. This was not a lack of effort. It was not a failure of science. It was a limitation written into the law. If the killer had been arrested for another violent crime but not yet convicted, his DNA would not automatically be in the system. That gap meant that even if law enforcement had crossed paths with him, even if he had been sitting in a jail cell for something else, there might be no connection made to Katie's case. The DNA profile remained in CODIS, silent, waiting for the day when the system would finally catch up to the evidence. And for the Sepich family, that wait felt endless. Nearly 3 months after Katie Sepich was killed, the break in the case did not come from a new witness. It did not come from someone remembering a detail they had overlooked, and it did not come from a sudden confession. It came from an entirely separate crime. In November 2003, police in Las Cruces responded to a violent home invasion. Late at night, a man had broken into a residence where 2 young women were inside. It was the kind of call officers treat with urgency, unpredictable, dangerous, potentially deadly. According to court records, the intruder entered the home while the women were present, terrified. They locked themselves inside a room and called 911. Dispatchers stayed on the line as officers rushed to the scene. Police arrived before anyone was physically harmed and arrested the suspect. His name was Gabriel Avila. At that moment, his arrest had no known connection to Katie Sepich's murder. He was simply another suspect in another violent crime. But what happened next would change everything. Under New Mexico law at the time, DNA was typically collected after conviction for certain felonies, not immediately at arrest. That meant investigators in Katie's case still had no match inside the system. But when Avila was later convicted for the home invasion, authorities were finally permitted to collect his DNA sample. That sample was processed and entered into CODIS, the national DNA database that had been holding the unknown profile from Katie's case for months. This time, the system responded. Gabriel Avila's DNA matched the genetic material recovered from Katie Sepich. For investigators, the hit was definitive. The science was clear. The profile taken from the home invasion suspect was the same profile collected from the scene of Katie's murder. After months of uncertainty, the unknown DNA finally had a name attached to it. Detectives moved quickly. They reviewed Avila's background, his movements, and his proximity to Katie's neighborhood. They prepared to confront him with the evidence. For Katie's parents, Gianna and Dave Sepich, the call bringing this news was overwhelming. There was relief in knowing the person responsible had been identified, but there was also anger and heartbreak. The match came not because the system worked immediately, but because another violent crime had occurred. If DNA had been collected at the time of Avila's arrest for the home invasion, the connection might have been made sooner. The timeline forced a painful question. How much sooner could justice have come? When confronted with the DNA evidence, Avila faced facts that could not easily be explained away. The genetic match tied him directly to the crime scene, according to investigators. The scientific evidence was overwhelming. Eventually, he confessed. He admitted to encountering Katie in the early morning hours near her home. He admitted to following her, attacking her, sexually assaulting her, and killing her. He admitted to moving her body away from the neighborhood in an attempt to hide what he had done. The mystery that had haunted Las Cruces for months was finally solved. But the way it was solved exposed a flaw in the system. The evidence had been there from the beginning. The DNA profile had existed within days of Katie's murder. It simply did not have a match until chance placed her killer back into custody for another crime. For investigators, it was a breakthrough. For the Sepich family, it was both justice and a reminder that the law, at that time, had delayed the answer they had been waiting for by 2007. The legal process in the case of Katie Sepich moved toward its final stage. The man identified through DNA, Gabriel Avila, faced overwhelming evidence against him. The genetic match tied him directly to the crime scene, and his own admissions left little room for doubt. Rather than taking the case to trial, Avila chose to plead guilty. He admitted to first-degree murder, criminal sexual penetration, kidnapping, and tampering with evidence. The plea meant there would be no lengthy courtroom battle, no drawn-out testimony replaying every painful detail in front of a jury. For Katie's family, the decision carried mixed emotions. A trial could have meant more public exposure of the evidence, more cross-examination, more days sitting in a courtroom hearing about their daughter's final moments. The guilty plea spared them that process, but it did not lessen the weight of what had happened. During sentencing, the court imposed a 69-year prison term, a sentence designed to ensure that Avila would spend the majority of his life behind bars. There was no dramatic reaction in the courtroom, no visible relief that could undo the past, just a heavy silence that followed the judge's words. Justice, in the legal sense, had been delivered, but for Gianna and Dave Sepich, justice did not mean restoration. It did not bring back birthdays missed, holidays that would never feel complete, or the future their daughter had planned for herself. They listened as the charges were read, as the sentence was pronounced, understanding that this chapter of the case was closing, but another chapter was just beginning. Because even as the court concluded its role, larger questions remained unanswered. The timeline of the case was impossible to ignore. Katie was murdered. In August 2003, her killer was identified only after he committed another violent crime in November 2003, and the DNA match occurred because the law allowed collection after conviction, not at arrest. For the Sepich family, that delay represented something more than a technical detail. It represented months during which the person responsible remained unidentified, months in which another crime occurred. They began to ask a difficult question. If DNA had been collected immediately at arrest for violent felonies, could the system have connected Gabriel Avila to Katie's murder sooner? The answer pointed toward a gap in the law. In New Mexico at that time, DNA collection policies did not fully reflect the capabilities of modern forensic science. The science was ready, but the statutes had not caught up. Instead of retreating into private grief, Katie's parents chose a different path. They decided that their daughter's story would not end with a prison sentence. They began speaking publicly about the case, explaining how DNA evidence existed from the start, how it waited in a database without a match, and how a simple change in the law could help prevent similar delays in the future. Their advocacy focused on one clear goal, requiring DNA to be collected at the time of arrest for violent felonies. Not only after conviction, the proposal would later become known as Katie's Law. What began as a criminal case in Las Cruces was now evolving into something broader, a conversation about public safety, forensic technology, and the responsibility of the justice system to use every available tool. The courtroom proceedings had ended, but the fight for change was just beginning. After the sentencing of Gabriel Avila, the legal chapter of Katie Sepich's case was closed. But for her family, life did not return to normal. There was no reset button. No moment when the weight suddenly lifted. There was only absence. The quiet spaces where Katie's voice should have been. Gianna and Dave Sepich spoke openly in later years about what that absence felt like. It was not just the major milestones that hurt. It was the ordinary days, the phone calls that never came, the holidays that felt incomplete, the realization that their daughter would never grow older than 22. They understood that justice in a courtroom does not equal healing. A prison sentence holds someone accountable, but it does not restore what was taken. Instead of allowing their grief to remain private, they chose to channel it into action. They began advocating for legislative reform, explaining again and again how DNA evidence in Katie's case existed almost immediately. Yet the system could not use it effectively. Because of legal limitations, their effort focused on changing how DNA was collected in violent felony cases. At the time, New Mexico required collection after conviction for certain crimes, The Sepich family argued that collecting DNA at the time of arrest for violent felonies would close the gap that delayed identification in Katie's case. In 2006, New Mexico passed what became known as Katie's Law, requiring DNA samples to be taken at the time of arrest for violent felony charges. It was a direct response to the flaws exposed by her case. The impact did not stop at the state level. In 2010, federal legislation expanded similar DNA collection policies nationwide, influencing how law enforcement agencies across the country used forensic evidence. What began as a tragedy in Las Cruces helped reshape policy far beyond New Mexico. Katie Sepich testified before lawmakers, describing the months she waited for answers, the frustration of knowing the evidence existed but could not yet produce a name. Her message was direct and personal. No other family should have to endure that delay when the science is already available. Over time, Katie's name became associated not only with a crime, but with reform. Every time a DNA sample is collected at arrest for a violent felony, every time a database match happens sooner rather than later, her legacy is part of that process. For her siblings and friends, remembering Katie meant focusing on who she was before the headlines, before courtrooms, before legislation. They remembered her confidence, her humor, her determination, her stubborn streak. They refused to let her identity be reduced to a case file. Katie Sepich's life ended in violence, but her story did not end there. It moved into law books, into police procedures, into the structure of the justice system itself. Her case serves as a reminder that justice is not only about punishment, it is about prevention. It is about learning from failure and correcting it. It is about ensuring that when science provides an answer, the law allows it to be used. Katie was 22 years old, with plans, ambitions, and a future ahead of her. That future was stolen. But through the changes that followed, her impact continues. Not just in New Mexico, but across the United States. A legacy born from tragedy, built into the system, and carried forward every time DNA helps bring answers to families still waiting.